is set in the old days of Ireland, in the county of Dublin. Now, in these times, the people of Ireland used baskets woven from the sally rods of willow trees to carry and bring anything they might need. Now, the people who wove these baskets, the basket weavers, were in high demand and they were highly skilled. And the willow trees themselves were few and far between. So our story begins with one such a man, a basket weaver from County Dublin. He was known the length and breadth of the country as the best basket weaver. And he was in high demand. He worked all day and most nights to make all the baskets that he needed. But at the end of one particularly busy summer, he discovered that there were no sally rods to be had in the whole of County Dublin. The only one left, the only single willow tree, was on the outskirts of the city in the middle of a small field. So out he set one day to this field and to this one willow tree. And on his way, he met a young man coming in the opposite direction. And he stopped him in his tracks and he said, "Don't go into that field, and don't even go near the tree. That is protected by the She, a fairy tree, and you never know what might happen to you if you were to interfere with it." Well, the man knew, as most of us do, the fairy stories of Ireland and what happens to you when you mess with the fairies. So he turned on his heel and he headed back the way he had come. But as he was walking, he started thinking about all the baskets he wouldn't be able to make, and all the money he wouldn't have in his pocket, and all the pints of porter in the pub he wouldn't be able to buy. So he turned once again and headed back towards the field, hopped over the stone wall and headed straight towards the tree. And when he got there, he started to pull down the long branches of the willow tree, long, supple branches, perfect for making his baskets. He was delighted. He had one bundle and another, and soon he had armfuls of the sally rods. But before long, before he had gathered all he needed, the sky began to grow dark. A wind began to blow, and he looked down to the base of the tree. Small bits of fog, small swirls began to raise from the roots, faster and faster, faster than any fog he had ever seen. It was up to his knees, up to his waist, up to his chest before he could draw breath. And soon, he couldn't see beyond the edge of his nose. Well, this was a strange field and outside of the city, so all he could do was sit down and wait for the fog to clear. Off in the distance, he saw a small light. And as we know, where there's light, there's people. And so Brian O'Connell headed towards this light. When he followed it, he found a small cottage, an old-fashioned cottage with a thatched roof and a half door. He went and knocked upon the door, and an old woman opened it. "Ah, Brian O'Connell, we're delighted to see you. Come on in here now and have a sup of tea. Sure, come in and tell us a story." Brian had never met this woman before in his life. But it was Dublin, and Dublin is a small town, and who was he to question it? So in he went, and he sat down at the table and had his dinner and had a chat. And her husband was there too. He sat by the hearth with a pipe in his gob, said very little, as old Irishmen do, but gave him a good looking over with the eye. And they talked back and forth, and they had their food. And when they had finished, and when they were drinking a glass of whiskey, the old man turned to him and said, "Brian O'Connell, would you tell us a story there? A fairy story now, or a tune, or something to entertain us." Well, Brian shuffled his feet and he looked at the floor and he said, I'm not very good at the stories now. I haven't a story in my head and not a tune to me either. The truth of it was that when his dad and his grandfather were telling the stories, he was down the pub. He hadn't a story to tell them. Well, the old man and the old woman were very disappointed, and they looked at him a bit disgusted. And the old woman said, "Well, if you can't do anything else for us, would you go out and get us a bucket of water from the well, if that's all you can do?" So he was falling over himself to make up for this. So off he went, picked up the bucket out the door, and over across the road to the well. It was an old stone well. It looked like it had been there for quite some time. Moss was growing along the top. He took the bucket and lowered it down into the well. He heard the splash and began to pull on the rope once again. But as the bucket began to raise, he felt a wind pick up. He heard it rustling the leaves in the trees, felt it picking at his clothes and his hair. Before he knew it, his hat was blown off, flew down the fields. Or was that his feet lifting from the ground? In a moment, he was lifted up into the air by the she-gui, the fairy wind, and was swirled up into darkness and was twisting and turning and could see nothing but fog and darkness. A moment later, he found himself back down on the grass. He could see nothing, but once again, a light in the distance. He followed it and found another cottage. It looked just like the last one with the half door and the thatched roof, and so he went forward again, expecting the old man and the old woman. But when he looked through the half door, he saw instead a line of 4 old men sitting on a bench with their backs to the walls, looking fairly grumpy. They had pipes in their gobs and caps on their heads, and they looked down at the dusty floor. When he turned his head to the left, he saw a young, beautiful woman with long red hair to her waist and a beautiful green dress. And beside her was a coffin. He had stumbled on a wake house. Well, he knew he shouldn't be here, and so he began to back out of the door. But before he could, the woman called to him, "Brian O'Connell, is it yourself? Come in, talk to me in my hour of sorrow." And sure, you can't say no to a beautiful young woman. So in he went, but once again, he had no idea how she knew his name. He went and stood by the coffin and talked to her. But as with most Irish men of the time, and also now, he had very little idea of how to talk to women. So they had their banter back and forth, her making most of the effort. But very soon, they fell to silence. Now, the old men were shuffling their feet and looking a little grumpy in the corner. Before long, one of them piped up. "By Jesus, this is the most boring wake I've ever been to. There's not a bit of crack or cure. Would someone send for a feckin' fiddler already before I get into the coffin with your man?" Well, one of the other men was just about to raise himself up and go out the door looking for a fiddler when the young woman raised her hand to stop him. "So where are you going, Mick? Haven't we the finest fiddler in County Dublin here in the house, Brian O'Connell?" Now, Brian looked at her in amazement. He couldn't string 2 notes together in his head, let alone upon any instrument. Again, had been down the pub. So what was he to do? He said to her, No, you've got the wrong man. I can't play the fiddle. I don't know the first thing about playing music. But no matter what he said, and despite his protestations, they brought forward a fiddle and a bow, and they plonked him on the table right in front of him. Well, they coaxed him till he put the fiddle under his neck, and he put the bow in his hand. But the moment he put the bow to the strings, he began to play the most beautiful music he had ever heard. His fingers took over, his hands played the music all by themselves. His fingers danced a ceilidh across the strings, and the old men danced a ceilidh on the floor. A book set, because there were no ladies. And the young woman clapped the rhythm with her hands. After an hour, after 2 of dancing, when the men were exhausted and they fell down to have a cup of whiskey to revive themselves, he put down the fiddle. He stared at it and at his hands. What had happened? Before long, they decided that it was time to bring the coffin to the graveyard and that the wake time was over. So once again, the 4 men stood up and they took the coffin and raised it up onto their shoulders. But there was a problem. One of the 4 men was a whole foot taller than the other 3, and so the coffin was a little bit lopsided. Now, what do you do in such a situation? Well, one of the men piped up and he said, "Would you go out there now and send for a surgeon till we shorten Jimmy's legs there by a good foot?" Well, Brian didn't know what to say to this, so he kept quiet. But once again, the young woman raised her hand to stop them, and she said, "Sure, what would you be doing going and sending for a surgeon? Haven't we the finest surgeon in County Dublin here in the house, Brian O'Connell?" Once again, Brian looked at her in amazement. What was she talking about? He could hardly look at a drop of blood from a cut on his finger without fainting, let alone could open a man. But what was he to do? They set a hacksaw and a knife on the table in front of him, and he looked on in horror as this man sat down on a stool and plonked his leg up on the table and said, "Off you go there now, a foot'll do." So he picked up the hacksaw and he picked up the knife, and as soon as he had set the blade to the man's leg, once again his hand took over. And he hacked back and forth until finally the man's foot fell off and plonked right on the dusty floor of the cottage. And then under the knee, back and forth until his whole shin fell off. And then he picked up the foot, stuck it back on the knee, and added a few stitches for good measure. Well, the man put the new leg down on the ground, hopped up and down. "Geez, that's a fine job. Now do the other one and be quick about it. We have some more to do." And so he did, put the other leg up on the table, back and forth, foot off, back and forth, leg off, and put the foot back on the knee. Brian didn't know what to say, but he went with it, as you do. So, after this had happened, they hoiked up the coffin once again, put it up on their shoulders, and headed out the door. Now, Brian and the young woman followed in respectful silence, and after only a few minutes, they reached the graveyard. He had never known there to be a graveyard in this part of Dublin. But they arrived through the fog and through all the looming headstones through the fog. And finally they came to the open grave. And above the open grave was a blank headstone. Now, this was quite unusual. And Brian was just looking at it when he heard a cry from behind him. He turned around to see that one of the men had stumbled and the lid had fallen off the coffin. They all peered in with a sort of morbid curiosity to find that the coffin was empty. They all looked at each other. Again, one of the men piped up, "Jesus, boys, we've forgotten the body. Well, one of you go back and get the body, we'll put it in the coffin, put it in the ground, and we'll make a night of it." But the young woman raised her hand to stop them. And she said, "Well, sure, what would you be going off to find a body when we have the finest body in County Dublin here, Brian O'Connell?" This time, Brian did not look on in amazement, but rather in something we might call horror. And he turned on his heel and he fled from the graveyard, past the cottage until he found the well. And there he thrust the bucket down into the well and let the rope go. As he did, he felt the shigui begin to pick up once again. He felt it pick at his clothes and pick at his hair. And before he knew it, he was up in the air once again, swirling in the darkness. He came back down to the ground and found that the fog had cleared. Before him once again, he saw the cottage and also the bucket at his feet, full of water this time. He picked up the bucket and ran to the house, and inside he found the old man and the old woman. He threw himself into a chair, gasping for breath, and knocked back a glass of whiskey. The old woman looked at him and said, "Brian O'Connell, what's the matter with you at all?" And he said, "Well, I have your bucket of water, but I also have a story." And it's said that after this day, Brian O'Connell never once again made a basket and never went near a willow tree. But he made a fine trade as the best fiddler and the best surgeon in County Dublin.